Okay. Thank you, Alana. Let me pause and let me know how we're doing with the technical stuff. I am Attia. I'm over here in Binghamton, New York, and it's really a pleasure to be back in Boston with all of you for an evening. I see some familiar faces and some new, so that's really fun, as well as some of my Brandeis students and some of my Binghamton students. So it's really a mix of everybody from everywhere, and there's no better way to get ready for Hanukkah than to come back together and to learn a little bit. I was actually thinking this week, I think I've taught for Mayan about 12 or 13 times now, and almost all of them are for the Chagim. I've covered almost every Chag through Mayan, so that's kind of cool. I don't know what's going to happen after we finish all the Chagim. We'll have to come up with a new series, but it's a really fun thing to do a cycle with one group. So thank you for having me again. And I really want to jump into our learning because we have a lot to accomplish tonight. The topic on hand is Judah or Judith. Will the real Hanukkah hero please stand up? The truth is the title is a little bit more witty than the topic is. The topic is really about Judith more than Judah. In fact, Judah won't be making an appearance at all tonight. We are going to be exploring the heroine of the Hanukkah story. Or are we? And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. So before we even start with the learning, I'd like to pose a question to the group. And feel free to write in the chat or to shout it out. Did I hold on one second? Alana, is it recording?
Yeah, it's recording now. Just be careful you don't pause the recording again.
Got it. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Just saw your chat. Okay, so please feel free to shout it out or to write this in the chat. I don't see all your faces because of the way my Zoom works. So what do you know about Judith? Write any or shout out any associations you have with Yehudit, Judith.
Cheese.
Cheese. Right, cut off Holofernes's head. Okay. Any other associations? Okay, great. So we have a blank slate basically tonight, and we're going to have a little bit of damage control to do, a little bit of undoing, because most people, when I ask this question, the first thing that they say is cheese. And before we learn anything at all, I'm here to tell you that the cheese thing might be a myth. So let's dive right in. If you'd come with me to source number 1 on your source sheet, which I'll also be sharing on screen. Are you guys seeing my screen right now? The Mayan?
Seeing Mayan.
You are seeing it?
Yeah.
Shuli's not seeing it? Okay. And you see it as we're ending screens here? Okay, awesome. So when we get into our first source here on the page, what I'd like to call your attention to is something called a Yotzer. Does anybody go to a shul where Yotzros are said? Feel free to just shout it out. Okay, so no one. Yotzros, which I'm purposely saying with an Ashkenazi accent, despite my reticence to do so as a good Sephardi Jew. Yotzros are usually said in Ashkenazi shuls. It's a piyut or a prayer or a poem that is inserted after Baruch Hu and before Shema. And there are multiple Yotzrot that exist, and there are specific ones that are said on specific days of the Jewish calendar. One such Yotzer is the one that you're looking at on the screen right now. I apologize for that. Odecha ki anafta bi. That I give thanks to you, God, even though or despite your anger with me. This is a Hanukkah Yotzer. I gave you a very small excerpt of this Yotzer. It's actually extremely long because it's an acrostic, as you can see from this excerpt. What it does is it goes through the entire alphabet, the entire Hebrew alphabet, and for each letter, it gives 9 lines, 3 stanzas. So you can imagine it's quite a long Yotzer. And it goes through the various miracles of the Hanukkah story. One such miracle that it brings up, in addition to the one that you've already learned in Hebrew school or throughout your Jewish life, it talks about Mattityahu, talks about the Maccabim, but one of the things that it brings up is Yehudit, Judith. And for the sake of time, we'll read some of this in English. During that night, Judith came to my defense. Her secret project was blessed and her reasoning excellent. She encouraged her people and was a torch of fire against Greece. Content that the city and its citizens were on the right path, she was very happy and went with her slave, and putting all her hope in God, she stopped at the entrance of the enemy encampment in order to undo their happiness and make them suffer and feel the punishment for the sins of their leader. And as we had somebody shout out already, what we know Judith goes on to do, or some of us might know, or as the Yotter continues, Judith then goes on to cut off the head of a Greek army general named Holofernes, and she brings his head back to her people, and there's a whole story there. We're going to learn a lot more about it. But this story here of Judith is told to us as a Hanukkah story, that Judith is a hero of the Hanukkah story. The title of the Yotter stems from a pasuk in Yeshayahu. I also brought here an illustrated siddur that shows that this piyut, this Yotter, is one that's been said for hundreds, thousands of years, really 1,000 years or so. And this is something that for a very long time we've associated with the story of Hanukkah. Now, what's interesting is, as I've kind of hinted to, it's not so clear that there is a relationship between Judith and the Hanukkah story, as we will see over the course of this year. Before we can even talk about whether it's related or not, I would like to explore this story, just kind of give you a summary of the story, so we're all kind of on a level playing field here. And so what you have here in source number 3 is a summary that was written by a professor of in Hebrew U. She's in the classics department, Professor Deborah Levine-Gera, and she writes a pretty good summary here in source number 3. So just take a minute, if you don't mind, and read this source to yourself. And when you're done reading it, just write in the chat "done," so that I know we're all on the same page here. Give it another minute. Wrapping up. So we have this crazy story here of this woman, Judith, who, as the summary tells us, lived at the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. And in order to help her people who are under siege, she goes and she enchants this general, Holofernes, and she tempts him, and eventually he falls asleep and she chops off his head and she brings it back to her people, and everybody praises her and the victory that she brings to the Jewish people. Now, this is a rather crazy story. I don't know if anybody has ever learned this before, but it certainly reminded me the first time I learned it of another story. What story is that?
Devorah and Yael.
Right, certainly. There is this story in Sefer Shoftim, in Judges, of a woman, Yael, who, in order to save the Jewish people, tempts a general, seduces a general, gives him wine and cheese, he falls asleep, and she kills him with a tent peg. Now, there's no tent peg in this story, just a sword, but definitely certain similarities to that story that we know. Now, let me ask you a question. I kind of set you up for failure because I gave you a summary, but where do we actually know this story from? Where is the story of Judith told? I love the dead silence because I feel like we're learning something important here. Yeah, Hannah, what were you going to say?
Is it in the Apocrypha?
Great. Okay, so Hannah said that Judith is written in the Apocrypha. For those who don't know, the Apocrypha is the tradition, Jewish tradition, books and writings that have been passed down through Jewish tradition, but for one reason or another, were never actually canonized. So they're not part of Tanakh, but they have still kind of floated through Jewish history and landed on our desks here. So we know about a lot of them. There are many reasons outside the scope of this year that each book that is in the Apocrypha did not make it into Tanakh. Each one kind of has its own reason, but Judith is first made known to us through the Apocrypha, these non-canonized books of the Torah. Okay, we do not have any original Hebrew version of this story. It seems like the first version of it was written in Greek, which is kind of ironic considering it's a victory against the Greeks, perhaps. It does, for the first time within the, let's call it canonized Masorah, the Masorah that's officially sanctioned by the rabbis, the first time the story of Judith does show up is in the Rishonim. And in the Achronim. So in commentaries on the Gemara. It never shows up in the Gemara. It does not show up in the Mishnah for sure. But in the commentary on the Gemara, we start to see hints about the story of Judith and certain explicit mentions of her. And then that carries through into halacha, into our legal system. Now, what we're going to accomplish tonight is, first of all, learn a little bit more about the story of Yehudit. We're going to ask the question, is this a Hanukkah story? There are reasons to doubt it. We are going to talk about the connection between this Judith story and certain minhagim, certain customs and halachot, laws of Hanukkah, and why and how those laws came to be. And then we'll conclude with some personal meaning and how to connect all of this to our celebration of Hanukkah. So that's what we're setting out to accomplish over the next 45 minutes, okay? So join me in learning. We'll go first to the halachic discussion that I mentioned. Does anybody know, after having read this summary, does anything come to mind in terms of what customs or laws we keep on Hanukkah because of the Judith story?
Singing a victory song?
Okay, singing a victory song, that's certainly something that we do on Hanukkah. We have Al Hanisim. I think that might be what you're referring to. Interestingly enough, the victory song that Judith sings really is similar to the victory song of Devorah, but that's not one of the customs that I had in mind. It might be connected to Judith. I've never seen it explicitly linked in halacha. So it's an interesting thing. So I'll say them and you guys are going to probably kick yourselves, okay? So first one someone mentioned already. One of the customs that is linked to Judith is for women not to work after lighting Hanukkah candles, okay? I see some familiar smiles or maybe some shock. Sharona, what was your...
Well, I was wondering why.
Okay, so we'll get to that. The whys we're definitely going to get to. So one of them is women not working after they light Hanukkah candles. Another one is eating dairy on Hanukkah. Fun fact, Sharona actually makes cheese. So this one is something fun that relates to you, right? So a lot of people have the custom of eating cheese on Hanukkah. And the third one is, and this one everybody in this room should know, is women lighting Hanukkah candles at all as a halacha, as a law, is not something that we take for granted and is linked to the Judith story. Now, we're going to explore these all inside. Don't take my word for it. So let's look at the first one. Let's look at women not working after candle lighting. Okay, so we have here the Shulchan Aruch, the halachic compendium. This is source 4. Women do not have the custom of not working while the candles are burning. And the Magen Avraham comments, Hanashim, davka nashim, specifically women, lefisha na'aseh nes al yedehem. Okay, so women do not have the custom of not working because the miracle was done by their hands. So because the miracle of Hanukkah was brought by a woman, we have the custom of not working after candle lighting until the candles have burnt down. Okay, the next one in source number 5, this is the dairy one that we mentioned. This is in the Ran. Sha'af hin hayu be'oto anes, that women too were included in the miracle. Okay, שגזרו יוונים על כל הבתולות הנשיאות שיבלו להגמן תחילה ועל ידי אישה נעשה נס. Okay, so we have kind of two different reasons. On the one hand, that women were subject to a decree by the Greeks that they were going to have to sleep with Greek generals before their wedding night. Okay, so there are these virgin brides who are planning on going pure into their weddings, and the Greeks decree this this evil decree that they have to be defiled before their wedding. So that's one reason that women might be kind of included and given an extra level of scrutiny on this holiday, or an extra level of engagement on this holiday because of that decree. And the other possibility is because the miracle was brought by the hand of a woman. And this source continues that we see that this, oh, sorry, I think I just changed the page. The Ran continues that the daughter of Yochanan, it does not say who this is, it does not mention Judith by name, fed the head of the enemy's cheese to cause him to become drunk. She cut off his head and they all fled. Okay, so Yehudit maybe gave this general cheese, got him very thirsty, then he needed wine, then he got drunk, he fell asleep, she chopped off his head, all because of the cheese. Now women have this custom, now people have this custom of eating cheese on Hanukkah related to this, okay? And in the next source, you'll see in the Kolbo, which is a halachic work, it's an unknown authorship. It makes reference to a midrash that supposedly talks about Yehudit. This is all very kind of mysterious because we have not pointed to any specific place where Yehudit is mentioned in context, how we know historically exactly, when she comes up or who she is. But the Kolbo mentions that women are obligated to light Hanukkah candles. This is now our third custom, that women are obligated to light Hanukkah candles because they too were included in the miracle. And here in the Kolbo, this is one of the earliest sources where we have a halachic comment about something that we're supposed to keep on Hanukkah that names Yehudit. Okay, so it says, V'yesh mefarshim she'al yedei isha ira lehem hanes hagadol hahu u'shema Yehudit. And there are those who say that by the hand of a woman, the miracle of Hanukkah was brought, and her name was Yehudit, k'moshe mefaresh be'agada, as the Agadata, as the Midrash tells us. And it continues on to tell us the story that we already know, and also spells out the same thing that we saw before, this idea that because of her getting him thirsty and drunk with the cheese, that's why we also have the custom of eating cheese, okay, or dairy. Now, what I'd like to explore with you, the third one a little bit more deeply, is the third custom, or really this is a law that we have, which is that women light the Hanukkah oil. Just by a show of hands, or just shout it out because I can't see you all, how many people here actually light their own Chanukah? Okay, wait, so I'm seeing. Okay, so we have a lot of Ashkenazim here, I see. I, as a Sephardi woman, do not light my own Chanukah. So you might say, oh, women maybe aren't obligated in lighting, but that's actually not true. We do see in Halakha that women are obligated to light or to be yotze, to fulfill their requirement by proxy of either a father or a husband. So women, as we see here in source number 7, are obligated in lighting the Chanukah. Isha v'aday madlika, a woman definitely lights the Chanukah. De Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Nashim chayavot b'ner Chanukah she'af hen hayu ba'oto anis. Women should definitely light Hanukkah candles because they too were included in the miracle. Now I'm going to pause here for a second. Why do we need a Gemara to tell us that women are obligated in the lighting of the Chanukah? Why would we think women are not obligated?
Because it's a mitzvah aseh shehazman groma.
Right, exactly. It's a time-bound mitzvah, and women in general are peturot, are not obligated in time-bound positive mitzvot, specifically those that are derabanan, those that are not Torah law, but rabbinic law. Okay, so lighting Hanukkah candles arguably is one of those mitzvot, and we would think that women might not be obligated in it, but the Gemara tells us because women were involved in the miracle, we are obligated in lighting Hanukkah candles. Now, before we actually go on to the next source, there is a breakdown of two possible ways to understand this. Okay, so I'd like to hear from you guys. If you had to break down what it means, that women too were included in the miracle, what could that mean, or how would you categorize those two options?
I suppose Judith was the representative of her gender. And instead of the men who were supposed to be the soldiers and the leaders and the aggressors, she took it upon herself.
Okay, so Chaya, if I understand what you're saying there is one woman who brought the miracle. She is the one who brought a military savior to the people, and as a representative of all womankind, women were involved in the miracle, right? So the miracle was brought at the hand of a woman. So that's like a very active understanding of what it means. Now, the other side of it is a more passive, what I understand to be a more passive inclusion of women in the miracle. And it's not that we brought the miracle, but that we were extra saved by the miracle because of that decree that we learned about in a few previous sources earlier. There was a decree, there were many decrees on the Jewish people. One of them was to defile the young Jewish brides. And because these women particularly were saved, or really extra saved, we were included in the miracle of Hanukkah, and therefore we have an extra obligation to light the Hanukkah candles. Okay, so a passive versus an active understanding of what it means that women are included in the miracle. But if we're talking about an active one, then it seems to be that it's Judith. Everything's pointing towards this woman, Judith, who saved the Jewish people. Now we can see in Rashi, this breakdown is really clearly, I think, mentioned here. Right, that the virgin brides were going to be defiled by the Greeks. That's one understanding of why women were included in the miracle. We were saved by the Hanukkah miracle, extra saved by it, versus the active al yad isha naseh nes, or by the hand of a woman. The Jewish people were saved and the miracle was brought. Now, what's interesting is Rashi does not name Yehudit. Do you see that? It just says that a woman is the one who saved everybody, but he does not mention Yehudit. Does anybody have any guesses as to why that might be?
Because of the horrific act that she committed in cutting off a head, which is not a very ladylike thing to do.
Okay, so we have maybe a slightly patriarchal view that Rashi couldn't handle the fact that a woman did something so violent and didn't want to mention her, but that presupposes that he knew, right?
Or to the contrary, to encourage women to have more initiative if they see something wrong, instead of waiting for the men to do it for themselves and for the women.
So you think by leaving it vague, by Rashi not mentioning that it was Yehudit, just Rashi saying a woman did it, a woman took action, it's kind of giving us a strong message that we can do that too.
Everything you can do, I can do better.
Okay, we certainly have a very strong woman here, and it's, I don't know if I'd want to be in her shoes and have to do what she did, but we can definitely admire her for her bravery, right? So what's interesting is just in terms of the timing and in terms of the historical context here, it seems like Rashi does actually know about Yehudit. In source number 9, which I don't think I brought here on the slideshow, or I might have misnumbered my sources a little bit, but in the source after this Rashi, what we have is I brought you Yeah, you're missing one of the Rashis, okay? But I did bring another Rashi for you this is from Yechezkel, somewhere completely different in Tanakh, where Rashi quotes the Yotzer that we quoted at the beginning of this year. So that source number 1 on your source sheet, Rashi knew about it because he literally quotes it when he's commenting on something in Yechezkel. So we can't say that Rashi had no idea of Yehudit's existence. He knew. And he knew that this Yotzer linked Yehudit to Hanukkah, and he did not make that jump. When he said that a woman is the one who was at the helm of the Hanukkah miracle, he does not mention Yehudit. You could either say Dafka didn't think that she was the woman and he left it out, or maybe he thought it didn't need to be said, right? Like you could kind of go in either direction with why he didn't mention it. So I think that's just something to put on the back burner in terms of why does Rashi leave it vague? Why is there no mention of who the woman is that goes behind that miracle? Now, if you look at the Rashbam, which is what number is it on your source sheet? Is it number 10?
9.
It's number 9 for you on your source sheet? Okay, so I messed up my own numbering. But here, what we have as number 9 on the share screen, the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, a French Tosafist. This is a grandson of Rashi. He also talks about Yehudit. He names her by name, or at least Tosfot tells us he names her by name. It's not still clear if Rashbam himself did mention Yehudit, but Rashbam says that a woman, Yehudit, was at the helm of the miracle. It was brought by her hand, and that is why women light the candles, and that we keep the minhagim and the halachot that we do on Hanukkah. Now, I keep saying to you, I keep dropping hints to everybody that it's not so clear that the story of Yehudit does belong with Hanukkah. It's not fair that I keep saying that and not justifying that. You should not take my word for it. Anybody who's ever learned with me knows, never take my word for anything. Challenge me on anything, okay? Now, the story of Yehudit, I told you it was passed down in the Apocrypha. What's interesting is, historically, it seems to have been written at the time of Hanukkah, and then it went dark. For about 1,000 years, we do not see any mention or any commentary or any other further writings on the story of Yehudit. And then about 1,000 years after the story of Hanukkah, Judith pops up again in a new version. Slightly less detailed about her beauty, and emphasizing other things. It brings in a lot more context, a lot more of those allusions to Devorah and Yael. There are some connections to Sefer Daniel. If you were to scroll down to the bottom of your source sheet, you'd see I gave you a comparison chart, so you can see that there are many allusions within the second version of Yehudit to Yael and to Daniel, and there are many historians who claim that Yehudit, the story of Judith, was either written and made up at the time of the story of Hanukkah in order to strengthen and bolster the Jewish people, or that it's an orphan story that took place at a completely different time in Jewish history. One of the proofs that they point to is when you look at the summary that I gave you earlier, I think it was source number 3, that it mentions that Yehudit lived at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is not even the Hanukkah story, right? So there are all these kind of historical holes, not to mention that the first thing that came to mind when we talked about Yehudit was cheese. Somebody said cheese, but the cheese thing doesn't even show up in the first version of the story. And the Greeks don't show up at all in the first version of the story. So there are, and I'm just naming a few little details, but there are many reasons that historians have to believe that Yehudit did not actually occur at all, or if it did occur, her story did occur, it didn't happen at the time of Hanukkah. So if you look at the next source on our source sheet, I brought you a very small excerpt of the Encyclopedia Judaica that talks about the holes in this story, that says that the date doesn't seem to match up, the kingdom doesn't seem to match up, and there are many other things. If you were to click on that link there, you would see that historians are really in doubt about whether Yehudit is a Hanukkah story at all. And it's not just historians, right? This is a Torah shir, so I'm not going to just tell you that historians don't like it, but actually within Jewish tradition, there are many people who do not like this story or do not think that it matches up perfectly with Hanukkah. So if you look at the Aruch HaShulchan, another halachic compendium from the 19th century, we see that he says, "Ve'od b'hamshech hazman na'aseh nes al yedei Yehudit," right? Later on, a miracle happened via Yehudit, "Hishtakeh al oyev ha'oyev chelev ve'al semach zeh yesh medaktikim le'chol gvina," right? So she made the enemy drunk by feeding him cheese, and therefore we have this custom to eat cheese on Hanukkah. And then look how he finishes. Af shelo haya zeh bisman nes Hanukkah. Even though the Judith story didn't actually happen at the time of Hanukkah. So it's a custom that we keep on Hanukkah, even though historically it didn't really happen that way. Okay, so that's one very interesting thing to come across. That was shocked. That was the first thing I came across when I was learning the story of Yehudit. So I was like, what's going on here? Because we have this halachic source that's telling us there's something we do because of Yehudit, even though Yehudit has nothing to do with Hanukkah, historically speaking.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So why did they think that Yehudi, like what was their connection with Yehudi and Hanukkah in the first place? Just because she was involved with Greeks?
So it's not even clear that she was involved with Greece. So that's that question that you're asking is exactly at the crux of this shiur, what we're learning. Why on earth did the halachists connect Judith to Hanukkah? Historically, there is much reason to doubt that she's connected at all. Okay, so great question, Sharona. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, actually, I have another question.
Sweet.
Did Yehudi have like a posse of women, or was it just her?
Great question too. So we see from the two versions of the story, the summary that I gave you before and Megillat Yehudit, that she had her handmaid with her. Okay, so she goes in, she seduces him, she cuts off his head, and then she and her handmaid like quickly wrap up his head and travel back to a city called Betulia, which is under siege. So first of all, Betulia is already, I think, a very interesting name for a city. What does the word Betulia remind you of? Virgins, right? Betulot. So already, if we're thinking that the miracle of Hanukkah for the women had to do with these virgin brides who had this evil decree against them, there's some nod and wink to that other aspect of the miracle besides just Yehudit's activism, but also like these Betulot that are being harassed. So I just think that that's interesting. But yes, we see that she has another woman by her side and supporting her, but I don't know about really any other women. Okay, so let's keep going. In source number 13, we'll see another reason to doubt. This is Rabbi Yaakov Emden in Mor Uketzia, where I paraphrase it, but what he says is the story of Yehudi took place during the first temple period, and it has nothing to do with Hanukkah. Nevertheless, women are obligated to light Hanukkah candles in memory of their being subject to and saved from the decree of, right? This is the passive inclusion in the miracle, that they be defiled by the local Greeks prior to the wedding. Judith is not mentioned in the book of Maccabees. Okay, so it's not just that Judith is not mentioned in Tanakh, and it's not just that Judith is not mentioned in the Gemara. Okay, but even in the book of Maccabees, which is already basically as apocryphal as it comes, they don't even mention Judith. And if anywhere, it would be there, right? Josephus doesn't mention her. It seems like Judith happened during the first temple. And so Rabbi Yaakov Emden does not think that this has anything to do with the Hanukkah story. Now, what I'd like to do is, okay, so really what we're left with, like Sharona pointed out and highlighted, which is wonderful, is that we're really left with the major problem. We have these three customs of Hanukkah: women waiting, not working after they light. We have eating cheese or dairy on Hanukkah, and we have women lighting the candles at all, despite it being a mitzvah aseh zman grama, all seemingly connected to the story of Yehudi. That seems to be the reason, or at least a leading reason for why we do these things. And yet historians and Jewish sources, very reliable Jewish sources, don't think that Yehudi is at all related to Hanukkah. historically speaking. So everybody with me? Kind of shocking, right? I'm going to deepen the question now, and then I'll pause and take any questions. The problem gets even deeper, because if you look at all the writings about Chanukah in the Gemara and in Al-Hanisim and in Rambam, Maimonides, what you'll find is that the way Chanukah is described is with there being two siloed miracles. What I mean by that is, if you look at source number 14, the Gemara that says, My Chanukah, what is Chanukah all about? It talks about two distinct things. One of them is a military victory by the Chashmonaim, and one of them is the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days. Okay, you see this distinction if you go to Al-Hanisim, which is the prayer that we add on to our benching, to our Birkat HaMazon, our grace after meals, as well as to the Amidah. This is what we say on Hanukkah. This Al-Hanisim, what is the miracle that it refers to? What's it talking about?
The victory.
The military victory, right? There's no mention here of the oil at all. So, and actually, a few years ago at Brandeis, I gave a shiur about what is at the essence of Hanukkah. What is the miracle of Hanukkah really? And it seems that there's actually a very strong divide. That there's the military victory, there's the oil, and the two are really siloed in terms of how they are spoken about in halachic literature as two different miracles. And we see in source number 16, the Rambam, he also silos these two. I split up these paragraphs. He did not, but in source number 16, you see the top half of his description of Hanukkah is all about the military victory. And in the second half, he talks about the oil. Okay, now why am I sharing this with you? There are two miracles on Hanukkah. Which miracle would you associate Judith with?
The military.
Military victory.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So everybody's with me. Judith is clearly, if she has anything to do with Hanukkah at all, she would be on that military victory side, not on the oil side. And yet, halachically, what we see is we're told women should light the Chanukiah because of Judith's military victory. So it's like this crossover, like she's leaving her lane, right? Any questions on that? Okay, so what's going on here? So first of all, if Judith is not historically associated with Hanukkah, if it's not a historically accurate association, what is she doing here at all? And then just to add a second layer to that question, even if she is historically somehow connected to Hanukkah, she's associated with a military victory, not the oil victory. So why are we suddenly running to keep a mitzvah that has nothing to do with the miracle that she seems to have performed?
I have a question. Are there any mitzvot or minhagim that have to do with the military victory? Like, it seems like lighting the candles is like really the only mitzvah, and that has to do with like the other silo that Judith is not part of. But like, is there any mitzvah that has to do with the military victory?
Great question, and you're already starting to intuit where we're going with this, okay? So hold on to that. Are there any other questions before we keep going? Okay, great. So so the next source that you have here is really just reiterating that question. We see again another Jewish source that says that Yehudit took place during the Persian period, right? So that would be Purim, but that Chazal decided to commemorate it during Hanukkah. So historically, it's not really a Hanukkah story, but Chazal for some reason put it here. And the question is why? And once they were putting it here, why did they associate it with the candle lighting at all? How does that make sense? So now I'd like to start moving towards an answer. In the next 15 minutes, we're very ambitious here. If you look at source number 18, this is the Rambam, Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah. He talks about about the mitzvah of Hanukkah. Okay, We'll read in English in the interest of time. Because of this, the sages of that generation enacted these 8 days. From the night of the 25th of Kislev should be the days of joy and Hallel. They light lamps in the evening at the entrances of houses on each night of the 8 months to demonstrate and reveal the miracle. And these days are called Chanukah. And one may neither eulogize nor fast on them like the days of Purim. And lighting lamps on them is a rabbinic mitzvah like the reading of the Megillah. Okay, now looking at this source. Anybody who's familiar with Rambam knows that he's pretty cut and dry. He doesn't mince words. He's not flowery. He's not poetic. If you were to look at this source, is there anything here that Rambam says that just seems extraneous or repetitive?
In comparison with Purim.
Okay, so the association with Purim, you might say, but specifically in how he describes what we do or what the Mitzvah of Hanukkah is. How does he describe it?
He talks about saying Hallel, but you wouldn't, and then it says you light the lamps at the entrance of house on each night of the 8 nights to demonstrate and reveal the miracle. We wouldn't say Hallel if there wasn't a miracle.
Okay, so you think it's extraneous to even say because there was a miracle. Like he could have just left it at, we say Hallel, and then it's obvious. Okay, so maybe I'm setting you up a little bit wrong. I can't think of exactly how to phrase this question, but I'd like to call your attention to the middle of Rambam. It's about, in the Hebrew, it's who just said that?
Just to demonstrate and reveal the miracle.
Right. Okay, so that's where I was going with it. I'm sure that there's truth to what everybody else is saying too, but what I'd like to highlight here is that Rambam, when he describes what is the essence of the candle lighting, he says that we have this obligation, leharot ulegalot et hanes, to demonstrate and to reveal the miracle. What is the difference between leharot ulegalot? So,
one is to reveal publicly, and the other, whichever one is which one. One is publicly and one is for yourself. I don't know.
Okay, so you could say that one is more introspective and one is more outward. However, he does seem to be talking about this in terms of Persume Nisa, in terms of publicizing the miracle to everybody. You'll see why. I'll give you a little bit more context soon, a little bit more of the Rambam, how he continues. But think about this. If you were trying to tell somebody about your favorite place, okay, so the first thing you might do is point to it, right? Leharot. To show that is my favorite place over there. But then what's the next thing you would need to do in order to make that a meaningful conversation? You would need to say why, right? So it's not just that's my favorite place. Everybody get it now. Everybody be as connected to that place as I am. No, right? You would say, I love Hawaii because it's where I find my ultimate peace and serenity, right? There's an aspect of revealing, legalot, that goes into making anybody feel connected to what you are trying to show them. So leharot, to show, and legalot, to reveal, to show the inner depths, what's really behind it. So those are two pieces of what Rambam says is the obligation when we light candles. When you kind of break it down like that, and I'm not making this up, this is something that Rav Soloveitchik darshans that he found inherent in the Rambam. When you separate and when you understand that leharot and legalot are two important and distinct steps of publicizing the Hanukkah miracle, we can kind of start to understand the connection to Yehudit. So if you look, here, so in source number 9, this is where Rav Soloveitchik points out the leharot and legalot, to show and to demonstrate versus to reveal. And he ends off by saying that it is our duty to analyze the meaning of the miracle, that is to reveal it. So not just to say there was a miracle, but that really God was behind everything. God was behind the victories of Hanukkah. Not just there was a Chanukiah, the oil that you see right in front of you. That is something that happened, but if you peel back the layers, there was a God behind the military victory. So that's Rav Soloveitchik on the Rambam. And when you understand it that way, if you look at Megillat Yehudit, the book of Judith, in source number 20, I didn't give this to you before. This is a really excerpted, cut down version of the whole story. But as you can see in the underlined parts of the story, as Yehudit is about to act, right before she cuts off the head of the enemy, she prays, right? O Lord God of all might, look in this hour on the work of my hands at the exaltation of Jerusalem. Now indeed is the time to help your heritage, right? So she prays to God. That's as she's approaching the bedchamber. Then as she's holding the general's hair in her hand, about to chop off his head, she says, give me strength today, O Lord of God Israel. Okay, then she takes the head with her to Betulia, and she says to the people, open the gate. God, our God, is with us. He's still showing his power in Israel and his strength against our enemies, as he has done today. So you would think if you were like a brave woman who just chopped off the head of a general, you might come and say, look what I did. Look at the military victory I've brought to you. But the first thing she says to the people is, look what God has done for you. And she says it again, praise God, oh praise him. Praise God who has not withdrawn his mercy from the house of Israel, but has destroyed our enemies by the might by my hand this very night, right? It's all about God through my hand, but it's all about God. Similar to Yosef and how he talks about God being behind everything he does. And then what happens next? If you look at the end of this, the Lord has struck him down by the hand of the woman, as the Lord lives, who has protected me in the way I went. And all the people hearing this, they're astonished. They're inspired, and they bow down and they worship God. And they said with one accord, blessed are you, our God, who on this day humiliated the enemies of our people, right? So because of Yehudit, who's not just saying, look, there was a miracle, it happened, but she really extols the virtue of God. She really reveals that he is behind the miracle. The people come around and they come to connect to that miracle themselves as well. Liharot, something happened. There are candles. There's something really, an obvious miracle. Ulegalot, something that you might not have noticed if I were not here to reveal it to you. You might not have seen that God was behind this military victory, but I'm bringing it to your attention. I'm explaining it to you. I'm connecting you to the miracle. And that is what Yehudit does for the people. Leharot ulegalot. Rambam continues a little bit later. This is about a chapter later after what we read. I think he makes it really clear here. First of all, he says something that he really does. I don't think he says this about any other commandments, any other mitzvot. He says, Ner Chanukah mitzvah chaviva hi me'od. It's a very dear mitzvah. Again, he's not flowery. He doesn't just say these things. So why does he find it to be so dear? Because we have the commandment, lehodia hanes ulehosif basheva ha'el. Lehodia lo al hanisim shasa lanu. So it's not just to acknowledge or to publicize the miracle, but to really to get to that place of legalot, to increase the praise, to show that God was really behind them, so that we increase the overall praise of God in the world. I'm sorry that we're rushing a little bit, but what I'm trying to say here is that what Judith represents is exactly what Rambam seems to be saying here. The essence of the miracle, the essence of the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is leharot ulegalot. And that's exactly what Yehudit does. That is how she acts. In this moment of crisis, she not only points out that a miracle that was obvious happened, but she reveals God's hidden hand and brings people closer to him through it. That is the essence of Hanukkah, and that is the essence of Yehudit. Now, I had asked you before about these two siloed mitzvot, about the oil, the two siloed nisim, miracles, the oil and the military victory. And Sharona pointed out that it maybe wasn't such a fair distinction to make. And I think that she's right. And I think that what we see through Judith And through all of this, and that's pointed out in sources 22 and 23 in the Tzafnat Paneach and in the Meiri, that you really can't separate the oil and the military victory. They really are one and the same. And by lighting Ner Chanukah, it's really our job to do that leharot ulegalot, to point out the obvious miracles and to point out the hidden miracles. And we do that all through Ner Chanukah, and that is exactly what Yehudit did. So taking a step back for a minute, I'm going to stop sharing, or I'll stop in a minute, actually. One last thing, I brought this nice little this paragraph from The Storyteller by a Jewish author, Walter Benjamin, where he talks about the difference between information and a story. And information kind of stops dead in its tracks. It doesn't survive beyond its telling. It loses itself over time, but a story is different. It does not expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength and is capable of releasing even after a long time. Now, the reason I brought all of this, can everybody see me? I stopped screen sharing. Okay. So we just rushed through a lot here, but what we accomplished is, first of all, we just learned a little bit about Yehudit, who I think many of us had not learned about before, right? And we learned about certain minhagim of Hanukkah. We asked the question of whether Yehudit is really a Hanukkah story. I think we're leaving it a little up in the air right now. I'm telling you what we're accomplishing in this overall shir because we did a lot in the last hour. We're leaving it a little up in the air. It's not conclusive one way or another whether Yehudit is historically connected to the story of Hanukkah. I'm inclined to say it's not a historical account that belongs in that time from a historical perspective, but I think the sages very intentionally connected it to Hanukkah because of the essence of Yehudit being the story that we needed for Hanukkah. She really represents that legalot, that leharot and legalot aspect of Hanukkah. And the sages saw that we needed that story in order to really bring that to life. So either they wrote it at the time of Hanukkah, or it's a story that really historically happened and they connected it. Either way. And so we have not even a justification, but really a source and a root and an inspiration for all the minhagim and the halachot that we say are connected to Judith. The cheese, the women not working after candle lighting, and women lighting candles at all, whether they're literally connected to Judith or whether they're more figuratively connected to Judith because of everything she represents. That is what we accomplished and connected tonight. So I hope that what you're walking away with is not necessarily a better understanding of who Yehudit was, because we did not really do a biographical understanding of her, but more of a conceptual. What does she represent? What does she add? What component does she add to the story of Hanukkah? And for our own personal takeaway, what my personal takeaway from this is, one, that when we talk about the Hanukkah miracle, it's not enough just to light the menorah. Now, I have to tell you, I have a 3-year-old who's in daycare, and it's not a Jewish daycare. And he came home the other day and told me that he has a Christmas tree in his classroom. So I was like, enough is enough. We're sending a Chanukiah out to your classroom. Like, you're going to show all your friends that you celebrate Hanukkah. So I sent him with a menorah, and I wrote a little note to the teacher. This is a menorah. This is how you use it. And then I learned this year, and I realized that I missed a piece. And this is my personal takeaway. I wasn't only supposed to leharot. I was also supposed to legalot. I was supposed to bring people closer to the story by revealing that God was behind the miracle. And that's something we believe in, and that's something we connect to. So that's one takeaway, that the way we celebrate Hanukkah should be taken one step deeper this year. It's not just enough to light the candle and say a miracle took place, but really to reveal it, really to look at God behind the story. That's one. And I think that we can extrapolate a little bit beyond that. Maybe this is a stretch, but God is really in our everyday life, right? There are the little miracles that happen all the time. And Yehudit reminds us that it's not enough just to say, yeah, God's involved, but really to try to reveal it, to really peel back the layers and to really see God's hand in our own miracles and in our own mundane. So thank you so much for learning. I'm happy to stick around if anybody has any questions. I know we rushed through, but I really appreciate everybody being here tonight, and Chanukah Sameach.
Chanukah Sameach. Thank you.
Thank you, Tari. Shar koach.
Thank you.
Very much.
Oh, that was so beautiful.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
I'm still curious about women not working after candle lighting. Why is that a minhag?
Right. So it doesn't seem to be like a direct corollary, whereas the cheese is like part of the story, right? There's no like Yehudit refrained from working, so women refrained. I think it's more coming from a place of that on Chagim in general, we have a question of whether there's milacha, an isur milacha or not. So there are some Chagim in the Jewish tradition, some holidays where you don't work. So for Hanukkah, Chazal came up with the question of should we work on Hanukkah or not? And what maybe it was a practical compromise in a way. What they said is, no, you're allowed to do milacha on Hanukkah, but women shouldn't, at least while the candles are burning, because women were extra graced by a miracle or extra involved in bringing about a miracle, depending on how you look at it. So it's like it's a pragmatic compromise regarding the question of milacha on Chagim.
Tal, isn't there something associated with Rosh Chodesh also and women not
Yes.
working? And
Yes.
Is that the same idea?
So it's actually not the same idea. It's more associated with the idea of women being like in sync with the Jewish calendar, the lunar calendar, the monthly cycle. But I do wonder if there's more of a connection there. It's something that I thought about connecting at some point after this.
I was going to ask a similar question because I don't remember if it was, I think it was Shulchan Aruch, and he used the word malacha instead of avoda. And those are like two very different ideas. So like, I don't think we're expected not to do malacha after candle lighting. So I was going to ask if it was work as in kind of like the idea of Rosh Chodesh and not doing work.
So it's funny you say that because if you actually look at all the it's like at first you think, oh, it's so nice. Women aren't allowed to work after the candle lighting. Like we're not going to have to fry all the latkes, but actually all the halachic sources say that you can cook. So it's a little bit I think the men who wrote that were hungry. But
this may not be where you want to go, but you've got me thinking. In one of the prayers that Judith makes, she calls on her father. She calls on the father Shimon. Right. It's one of the few places in Jewish liturgy where the Abba, whatever the patriarch we pray to, she prays to is Shimon, and I'm thinking about that in terms of. Judith is a widow, but she's a virgin widow in a sense, and the great deal is made in the story about the fact that she never has sex again. But it seems to me that her defense of virgins, or recovering virginity, if you will, I don't think it's where you wanted to go, but I'm just this connection between
it's a clear connection.
That part of the story of women's miracles, it's kind of interesting, which may actually not support the idea that it's not connected to Hanukkah.
Right. So first of all,
I'm going to think about it, but thanks.
I think there's a clear literary connection there. As I mentioned, the whole Megillah of Yehudit, it does borrow references from everywhere, and it's almost like it's built to call our attention to all these different places in Tanakh. And I do think that her reference to Shimon, to me, it's reminiscent of Shimon and Levi coming to Dinah's defense,
absolutely.
Right? And so, it's almost like I don't know if you want to call it a tikkun, maybe that's going too far, but it's like for not being able to protect Dinah from being raped, we have this woman Yehudit who's like coming and saving all the virgins of Israel. I think that that's a clear literary connection and certainly is worth exploring.
Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Any other questions?
You've enhanced our Hanukkah, that's for sure. Thank
Oh,
you.
good. I'm so glad. It's really interesting how, like, I think we all kind of know about Judith and, she's like in our sphere of like, oh yeah, she's kind of a Hanukkah story, but very few people really explore it and realize that it has these like murky roots. And I have a friend who just said she's teaching Hebrew school this week and she's teaching the Judith story for Hanukkah. And I was like, are you sure you want to teach that? So it's very interesting.
Well, it's better than teaching Chana.
That's possibly true.
Or that's the challenge, really. That's a challenge. Which women's model is it that's being marked?
So I think that bringing up this idea of her being a model, first of all, the name Yehudit, like you cannot get more generic than that, right? It's Jewish. And so if nothing else, like if you really think that Chazal might have written this story, I think that title alone is like a good reason to think they might have done that. And we also have the fact that there are so many elements borrowed from other women in Tanakh that makes it seem like, you know, there's a paradigm of a woman being built here. There are some historians who even say that there was a third woman, an unnamed woman, and that unnamed woman is the story of Hanukkah, and Judith is not the story of Hanukkah. It's a different story, which to me really points to these layers of like the paradigm of a woman following Yael, and now Yehudit, and now this unnamed woman, and like Chazal are really carving out this is what an ideal woman looks like, or an ideal military woman looks like. So it's interesting. But anyway, it looks like everybody's winding down. So thank you again, and be in touch. If you want to email me with any questions, feel free.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.